Dobar den, vo fokusu Silvana Pavlovska. You're watching YouTube channel In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. We're continuing our series dedicated to the Macedonian question, and in particular, the Prespa Agreement as cultural genocide of the Macedonian national identity towards the termination of an illegal treaty, a scholarly publication by Professor Igor Yanev, an expert on international law. And we are dealing with chapter 5.2 of that chapter, and this will be part 4. So today, just mentioning the date, is the 19th of April 2024, and we are going to share with you chapter 5, in particular 5.2, part 4 of that chapter, which will actually end the chapter 5. So Professor Igor Yanev says, in conclusion, the European Union and the Western states, or the so-called international community, in fact supported the extreme ethnocide Bulgarians' efforts for illegal Macedonian assimilation as a cultural genocide originally conducted by the Bulgarian fascist regime during the Second World War in the Macedonian territory under the Bulgarian occupation. So he's reminding us what happened during the Second World War and the involvement of the Bulgarian state, and that the international community, the EU and Western countries, in fact, supported this Bulgarian ethnocide, extreme ethnocide, Professor calls it, ethnocide efforts for an assimilation which is of an illegal nature as a cultural genocide and conducted by the Bulgarian fascist regime during the Second World War. It wasn't that long ago, was it? Similarly, with the Prespa Agreement, or the PA for short, is more than evident. Namely, the Prespa Treaty, the PA that is, nullified the existence of the Macedonian minority in Greece, and therefore elsewhere as well, on the grounds of non-recognition of their identity. Now, this is a serious matter that Professor Igor Yanev is actually making us aware of. I shall repeat this again. So he's saying, with the Prespa Agreement, it is more than evident of what the Bulgarian state is trying to do, or the politicians who govern that state. Namely, the Prespa Treaty or Agreement nullified the existence of the Macedonian minority in Greece and therefore elsewhere as well. Elsewhere means in Australia, in Macedonia, in America, in Canada, in parts of Europe, wherever the Macedonian people reside, as well on the grounds of non-recognition of their identity. So we have no identity, in other words. These aspects of the Prespa Treaty are in sharp violation of the basic norms of international customary and codified law related to the protection of minorities abroad, as indicated already. It appears that with the conclusion of the Prespa Agreement, the Macedonian government did not only nullify the existence of the Macedonian minority in Greece and in the world by signing that agreement, but based on dismissed and renounced national identity provisions in general, that is the erga omnes. Ethnic Macedonian national identity, erga omnes, was not recognized and therefore abolished even domestically as well. As indicated previously, the Prespa Agreement was and is still an illegal act, actually banning and prohibiting national identity to the Macedonians, an identity that was entirely sold to Greek state or nation. Professor Yanev has put these words sold to Greek in quotations. Yeah, sold to Greek state nation by the puppet government of Macedonia in order to obtain a start for the EU negotiations. That's what they've been telling the people all along for the last 30 years. Yeah, we want to be part of the European Union. There is a procedure we have to follow. And because there are all these conditions by the European Union, you know, and the United Nations conditions, we've got to do what they're telling us. That's what the government's been telling them. And they got apparently paid for all of that, for their widespread propaganda, trying to brainwash the Macedonian population and sell them something that really was quite the opposite. Yeah. Well, now the truths come out, and we are able to, thank you to Professor Igor Yanev and his amazing, well-researched and documented publication. We are able to know the truth and ask more questions, hopefully. Yeah. Has the Macedonian government, the current one, or the one that's, well, they're in election mode at the moment, so there is a technical government, so-called, and but the one that was in power up until recently, some would argue it's still in power. What's the evidence that they've actually done anything about getting into the European Union? And what are these promises that have never been delivered upon? So instead of recognizing and grasping a linkage between the two dubious identity treaties, that is the relationship between the Bulgarian treaty and the Greek treaty, that is the Prespa Agreement, and to advance proper question for referendum related to the termination of the Prespa Agreement as a #1 priority, VMRO-DPMNE, that is the opposition party, decided to put on the table for plebiscite only a weak question. That was a weak question, very weak, WEAK question relating to the law of ratification of the Bulgarian treaty concluded in 2017. And finally, after the unlawful rejection of that initiative for referendum by the government, namely, we've already told you in our previous broadcast, it was the Speaker of the Parliament, Talat Jaferi. Yeah. VMRO lost any plan, idea, or strategy for solving the actual problems with treaties and overthrow the government that supported the imposed assimilation. It was concluded by VMRO-DPMNE in June, July, and August 2022 on many occasions that early elections were necessary in order to save the country and the nation. The main strategy of VMRO, that is the opposition party, to realize that aim or objective, planning the overthrow of the government, mainly concentrated on the referendum in 2022, have finally failed with Speaker's rejection of that initiative. Nevertheless, popular support for the SDSM has also crumbled meanwhile. When it became self-evident to everyone that high threshold of 50% was in the actual turnout is unreachable, VMRO-DPMNE decided not to go further with a different question or a revised initiative for a referendum. In an effort to save VMRO from more embarrassment, the World Macedonian Congress WMC President Todor Petrov proposed a reasonable new question for popular plebiscite, and he wrote, quotation, "Are you in favor of the Treaty of Friendship, Good Neighborliness and Cooperation of the Republic of Macedonia and the Republic of Bulgaria, published in the official Gazette number 12/2018 of the 18th of January 2018. The idea for that new formulation, according to the WMC's President T. Petrov, was that in the case of the absence of that 50% or turnout below the 912,000 people participating in the referendum, interpretation would not be that the people actually agreed to or supported the Bulgarian treaty and the EU conditions, but rather boycotted vote on the matter related to national humiliation, so that in fact the people rejected the treaty. Despite the good idea launched by Todor Petrov aimed to save the initiative for a referendum vote, VMRO did not accept that proposal. Instead of trying to improve the question and to realize an original scenario, at least for the goal of overthrowing the government, they abandoned the idea for referendum and engaged party in radical propaganda related to personal discreditation, particularly of the mental capacities of the Prime Minister. Namely, it was discovered by VMRO that the Prime Minister Dimitar Kovachevsky did not serve the army in armed conflict in 2001 under medical diagnosis of being incapacitated or ill, and question placed by the VMRO was whether Kovachevsky in fact fabricated, that is illegally, that certificate, or was he really ill to the extent of incapacity to serve the army. All in all, it appears that VMRO de Permanent did not seriously devote the strategy of his party to the main goal for overthrowing the government, and that an entire opposition in similar manner as the SDSM started a dirty campaign in complete absence of political ideas. Namely, instead of capitalizing from disastrous SDSM's fiasco in national policy, erasure of identity, the erasing of identity, and other real problems related to the very survival of the Macedonian nation, VMRO party seriously turned to revealing crimes of the SDSM and DUI in order to discredit already discredited SDSM and political parties coalition running that government. Wrongful methodology of the main opposition party indicates that the political opposition in Macedonia will most likely need to wait for regular elections that are supposed to be held in 2024, writes the professor. Now we know that the elections will be on 8th of May this year, 2024. We'll most likely need to wait, unless some more other scandals show up in future. It appears, well, many scandals have appeared, but there hasn't been an election. It's going to be on the 8th of May, both presidential and parliamentary. It appears that VMRO de Permanent actually adjusted its political campaign to the low level of political culture common to the vast majority of Macedonians in Macedonia. What was surprising for me, says the professor, after years of analyzing people's behavior, is that an average Macedonian would more likely respond to the alleged crime affairs when national pride is blatantly violated. In conclusion, a bottom line of ineffectiveness of the Macedonian opposition appears to lie in a generally low level of average political culture of the Macedonian people, which in fact doesn't properly value a concept of freedom or independence. Clear example of the political ignorance and complete unawareness of Macedonians for national interest was demonstrated in the Macedonian presidential elections, which were held in 2019. Deeply divided Macedonians among themselves in large percentage, that is close to 40%, decided to support SDSM presidential candidate Stevo Pendarovski, even after the disgraceful national name constitutional revision 2019, in apparently illegal way, smuggling a vote of the one MP as mentioned previously in previous discussions. All those who voted for Stevo Pendarovski haven't understood the national degradation, humiliation, and grave consequences of the constitutional changes in January 2019, essentially erasing the national identity and statehood. On the other hand, VMRO-DPMNE apparently couldn't grasp the final outcome of national identity transformation aimed at radical derogation of sovereignty, and particularly couldn't foresee its effect on the new Bulgarian demands and blackmails with respect to the EU negotiations conditioning. In addition, we may also notice that even after all anti-Macedonian policies were openly conducted or sponsored by the EU, NATO and the USA, VMRO-DPMNE still strongly supports NATO and EU, and especially the European integration of Macedonia, which is the highest party priority, surprisingly. Even after explicit support of EU and NATO for policies of SDSM as political adversary of the opposition, VMRO's support for EU and NATO remains unchanged. However, we can point out here that most of the Macedonian people appear to understand a level of betrayal of the government proposing adoption of Bulgarian criteria for EU integration. For instance, with respect to the French proposal, 72.8% of the Macedonian population included in the survey answered no to the question. The question being, would you accept the opening of negotiations with the EU at the price of Macedonia agreeing to the so-called, or for the price of Macedonia agreeing to the so-called French proposal, end of quote. Still, this negative vote in the survey was apparently an outcome of strong campaign by the opposition parties explaining to people that French proposal was in favor of assimilation and negation of them as Macedonians. Despite that, it appears that VMRO-DPMNE is strongly dependent on their Western mentors and thus unable to pursue its own national policy. This conclusion is self-evident from the fact that VMRO intentionally avoided all debates over the nullification of the Prespa agreement. Leadership of this party, in the same manner as the leadership of the SDSM, dominantly rely on the support from Western allies and, in addition, Albanian political parties. Therefore, one shouldn't be very optimistic with respect to future patriotic maneuvers of the VMRO, as all Albanian political parties are against the idea for the nullification of the Prespa agreement and a Bulgarian treaty. Presently, it appears that VMRO's strategic commitment to align with essentially hostile parties from the Albanian bloc dispels any optimism that proper patriotic or national policies will be conducted in the near future. We could say that ultimately that outcome of political struggles in Macedonia and for Macedonia, its final Macedonian destiny, future of the PA and identity rests on the Macedonian people alone. If Macedonians choose wisely and terminate the Prespa agreement and the oppressive Bulgarian treaty, the nation may still survive the process of Bulgarian assimilation and extinction. Otherwise, it eventually will cease to exist, and the territory of the present state would be divided between the neighboring Bulgaria and Albania. This final outcome ultimately depends on national political leaders of the Macedonian people and their capacity truly to be committed to act independently in favor of the people and for their survival and the survival of national interests. So that was part 4 of chapter 5.2. Today's been 19th of April, 2024. I thank you for your attention. You've been listening to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.